Labdien visiem, kuri mums pievienojušies festivālā LAMPA, un šis ir viena no diskusijām, sarunām LAMPAs festivāla ietvaros, kas ir redzama arī tiešsaistē. Šī saruna noritēs angļu valodā, un sveicināt visi tie, kas ir klātsoši, sveicināt visi tie, kas mūs vēro attālināti. Liels prieks, ka šajā piekdienas vakarā mēs varam būt kopā ar jums, sveiki tiem, kuri šobrīd priecīgi ierodās un ieņem savas vietas. Man prieks redzēt arī pazīstamas sejas. Mani sauc Eva Johansone, un es esmu Latvijas televīzijas žurnāliste, ikdienā veido arī vides raidījumus, un jau kādu brīdi esmu iekšā ne tikai filozofijas, bet arī bioloģijas fakultātes, pētot dažādas biotopus un raizējoties par to, lai Latvijas daba tiktu saglabāta. I will continue in English. So this is a conversation, discussion about climate change, how to communicate that. It's named Speak My Language, and I would like to invite the organizer of this discussion, which is British Embassy. So His Excellency British Ambassador to the Republic of Latvia, Paul Brummel, please come on the stage. And you're the one who is going to say the opening words for this discussion. Please.
Paldies, Eva. Labdien! Mani sauc Pauls Brummels. Es esmu jaunais Lielbritānijas vēstnieks Latvijā. Man ir liels pagodinājums, ka Britu padome ir viens no galvenajiem festivāla LAMPA rīkotājiem. Un to, ka Lielbritānijas vēstniecība ir spējusi norganizēt un piedāvāt plašākai publikai šo diskusiju. UK is going to be hosting COP26, the climate change conference in Glasgow later this year, and providing the opportunity for the world to commit to the urgent action our planet needs. And a key part of that challenge is about communication. It's about ensuring that technically complex scientific information is presented in a way that everybody can understand, allowing every one of us to play our role in safeguarding the future of our planet. And now, to discuss the challenges and the opportunities here, it's over to our fantastic panel. Paldies.
Paldies. So, Ambassador has been here only 1 month, so it's quite impressive, his Latvian and pronunciation. Thank you. So, and today's discussion about the climate change, Speak My Language. We have two amazing speakers, and I have been talking with them a lot about this issue already, and that's Dagnija Leiņa, and she's a really passionate communication professional and expert with a special interest on technologies, startups, and community engagement, which is important in this conversation. And she's also the co-founder and CEO of the Startup and Corporate Policy and Lifestyle Multi-Event Meeting Platform Digital Freedom Festival. So she knows what festivals are. Hello, Dagnija. Thank you for joining us. And we have a second speaker. We can see him on the screen. He is smiling, so it's a good mood. It's Christopher Rapley. He's a British scientist, and he's a professor of climate science at University College London. He's also a patron of the Surrey Climate Commission and a member of the Science Museum Science Advisory Board and a member of the UK Clean Growth Fund Advisory Board. And his previous posts include Director of the Science Museum London, Director of the British Antarctic Survey, Chairman of the London Climate Change Partnership, President of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, and many, many, many more. Above all, he's a great and inspiring person. Hello, Chris, do you hear us? So we don't really hear you. Can you?
No, I'm now unmuted. Good to see you, Eva,
yes.
And glad to be here.
Yes, thank you for joining us. Chris said that he would really be happy to be here today, but as we know, the COVID happened. But one thing that he told me in an interview I had with him is that he tries to avoid flying as much as possible. So he's not only someone who inspires others to go against the climate crisis, but he's also the one who is practicing it. So, Dagnija and Chris are going to be two of my partners of discussion today. And I would like to start with a very simple question. What is a climate change, and does it really exist? Is it real? And I would like the professor to answer this question. I think it's a very complicated question, but I would like to hear your answer.
Thank you, Eva. Actually, as a physicist, it's not such a complicated question. As a physicist, I like to go to the basics. And the basic point is that we've managed to upset the energy balance of the planet. The planet captures heat and light from the sun. That energy moves the ocean and atmosphere around, drives the growth of plants, which we rely on. And then the heat is radiated back into the darkness of space. And over the long history of the planet, the incoming energy and the outgoing energy have been almost perfectly balanced. But by burning fossil fuels and adding carbon dioxide and indeed other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, we've made it harder for the energy that's trying to get back out through the atmosphere into space. And so as a result, the world is warming. In the UK, we generally like to make our cups of tea by boiling a kettle. And those kettles are usually 1.5 kilowatt kettles, so you can boil the water quickly. And that energy difference between what is coming into the planet and what is leaving the planet is the equivalent of all 7.9 billion people, all 7.9 billion of us on the planet, having 40 of those kettles running continuously, pouring hot water into the ocean. And that's not a bad metaphor, because most of that energy imbalance does go into the ocean, because the ocean covers 70% of the Earth's surface and is dark. And only 1% or so actually comes into the atmosphere and a few percent into the land. So whilst that energy is accumulating on the planet, it's not so obvious to us. We don't live in the ocean, and so we don't see that directly. But just to put it in context, that energy imbalance is 20 times larger than all of the energy that humanity generates every day to run the modern world. So all the electricity, all the power used for making things, for smelting steel, for mobility and so on. So it is a massive amount of energy which is slowly accumulating in the system and has been increasingly so over the last 50 years. And there are consequences. You know, as this energy accumulates, the planet warms. And the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which came out a couple of weeks ago, says that the measurements show that the planet is about 1.1 degrees centigrade warmer than it was in the time of my grandparents and their parents, the late part of the 19th century. So we've already seen a degree of warming, and of course there's more in store. And there's a sort of cascade of consequences of that. It means that ice and snow melt, and that adds water to the ocean. Because the ocean is gathering so much energy, it's expanding. As you heat it up, water expands, so sea level is rising. It changes the way the ocean and atmosphere circulate. So it changes the climatic patterns, the kind of weather that we will experience on average on a daily basis. So it changes the patterns of clouds and rainfall and winds and heat and so on. And there are a couple of particular things that I'd like to emphasize. A warmer atmosphere can carry more moisture. And so two things happen. Firstly, that atmosphere is sort of thirstier. It can draw moisture out of the ground and out of the vegetation more efficiently, 7% for every degree centigrade. And that makes the soils and the vegetation much drier, and so prone to drought and wildfires and so on. But it also means that the moisture in the atmosphere is much greater, so that when it rains, it will do so in much more intense bursts. And of course, that then leads to flash flooding, the sort of thing that we've seen really all over the world in recent weeks, but particularly in Europe, also in China. So that's bad enough. But there's another effect, and any professional gambler who understands how roulette wheels work knows that if there's a very small bias in the roulette wheel, then it makes a big difference, a disproportionate difference to the number of times particular combinations come up, winning combinations. And the same is true with the climate system. If you warm your local climate slightly, just a little, a degree or so, it makes a huge difference to the probability of certain extreme events happening. So what might have been the heat wave that you only experienced once in every 100 years will become the heat wave that you experience perhaps every 10 years, and the one that was every 10 years becomes every year. So we see a big impact on extreme events, and that applies to rainfall, to storm surges, and of course to heat and wildfires. So all of this has its impacts on us humans.
Un tāpat tās arī savvaļas ugunsgrēki.
On infrastructure and our health.
Un viss tas tiešām ietekmē
Not sure if
infrastruktūru.
You can hear this background speech, but there's something else coming in. Anyway, I hope you can still hear me. So the latest report says these results are unequivocal. It draws on 14,000 pieces of research. It shows that the last 4 decades have been successively warmer. The world is warmer today than it was for the last 125,000 years. CO2 levels are higher than they were for 2 million years. And it looks like we're on a path towards 3 degrees of warming by the end of this century, when we know that we need to keep below 2 and as close as possible to 1.5. So in summary of where we stand, you know, climate change, yes, it's real, it's us, it's serious, but we can do something about it. And so the positive message is that we need to stick to stubborn optimism. We still have our hand on the control knob. We can adjust what the future will look like. And we can talk about later on today exactly what we can do to change that control knob and be sure that we have a future that is livable and worth a good legacy for our children and grandchildren. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. I like this part about these microphones. Yes, thank you, Chris. I really like that part of the stubborn optimism and positivity. I hope we are going to keep it in this discussion as well. So, as I heard, the climate change is real, and I'm wondering why there is still a doubt or ignorance about the climate change. What have we done wrong in our communication? So why there are still a lot of people who are not trusting it or avoiding the trust in it. So I think it's a right time to ask the communication professionals like Dagny. You are from Latvia. You see and you follow the news in Latvia, and also you see the temperature in society. What have we done wrong?
Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Chris, for this introduction. And if you would ask me if the climate change is real, I would answer as a communication professional. I would say if people think it's real, then it's real. If people think it do not happen, then it doesn't happen, so it's not real. One of my favorite sayings in communications field is that perception is a reality. So do people think that there's a climate change happening at the moment? Yes, they are. And I checked the latest polls, and they say that it varies depending on the countries and continents, but in general, great majority, 70 to 90%, they say that climate change is happening. So it's not so that this issue does not exist. It exists and it is on the table. Then when we ask, do you worry about the climate change? And again, and there's a tendency of increase. More and more people say that they start worrying. And the next question is, do people agree that most of that climate change is caused by human activity? And again, more and more people, at the moment 60–70% in Europe, they say that we are part of this. And when I'm saying this that from communication perspective, if people say that this is a topic, so this means that there's open doors for some action to happen. But there are some challenges, and of course, as we already saw from the Chris presentation, climate issue actually it's a very complicated topic. And it's full of nuances, it's full of science, it's full of deep knowledge. Actually, you have to dive deep. But I think that it's also a very scary topic, and it's a topic of fear, and in a way a topic of about death. And I think that's why people feel very ignorant in many cases, because nobody wants to talk about death. And there's this big risk. If nobody wants to talk about death because it's scary, then it comes to avoidance. And at least this is how the story have been told so far. So I think this is problem number one, this narrative of death which we have experienced so far. Another challenge from communications perspective is that it has been so far a very abstract topic. In communications, in our professional field, we usually ask, before planning any campaign, we ask a question, what's needed for me? What's needed for me in this climate change discussion? What does it mean in my personal life? And so far, I think in many places, including Latvia, it has been a very abstract topic, meaning that if it's very abstract, if I don't feel it personally, it does not, I don't care so much. It's just how people's mind work. And, but I think that this year might in a way been a turning point, because suddenly we started receiving news from Europe, from our neighboring countries, from Greece, from Belgium, from Germany, about floods, about devastating heat, wood fires, etc., etc. So suddenly it becomes personally. And once we start feeling and experiencing something personally, then it gets real. So I think it's also very important to mention that in this context, this global is becoming local. This abstract is becoming very personal, and in a way we start really experiencing this, what we've been thinking about global village. So we're becoming in a way a global villagers, which means that we should think about this planet as a global village, and we see that we are all connected. But from communications perspective, for me, probably at this moment, the most important question is if we have awareness, if we have information, do we have desire to do something, and can we mobilize people around something to get something done? And to find a recipe, I think there should be some ingredients we should search for, and I really don't have answers yet. One of these is how to change this narrative from this death, hopeless, pessimist narrative to from this apocalyptic narrative to this hope narrative, to hope, future, love narrative. This is one thing. Another thing is trust. We can make changes only if we find people we can trust. If we can find these if we can find light at the end of the tunnel, there should be storytellers. Looking at the statistics, we are experiencing a massive trust crisis in the world at the moment. So whom we should trust? Are these media? But we know that media loves bad news or good news. Are these scientists? Yes, the trust is high, but they speak such complicated language nobody understands. Are these climate change activists? Yes, might be, but they're always so angry. Are these artists? Yes, but again, pessimists, melancholics, and sometimes after these exhibitions I feel even more pessimistic. Politicians, who trust politicians nowadays? Maybe these are influencers from social media. So these are these questions that makes me that I'm asking these days, and I don't have an answer yet. And the last but not least, I think that all the actions starts from our personal beliefs, from our personal stance. So I think it's very important to give this hope and to encourage people to think that even their smallest action really matters. To sum up, I think that there's no doubt that climate change is happening in the world, and if we look at the people's perception. So I think that first of all we should change this narrative from from story from death to hope. We should find the messengers who can tell this hope message, and I think that we should regain the belief that every action matters.
Thank you, Dagny. I would like to point out that we see a really beautiful pictures on the screen, and the pictures are by Mandy Baker. She's an award-winning environmental photographer. These are really beautiful. So it kind of, you know, you summed up and you said you have to give some hope in arts, and I think it's a beautiful example how we can see disaster in a very beautiful way. But yes, you mentioned about this death narrative, about this avoidance, about being scared. So that has been maybe our mistake in previous decades when we communicated the environmental disaster coming up. But how to put up the message, how to spread the message. I think that Chris has a really, really long history of communicating the environmental change as a physicist, both as a director of Science Museum London, as a personality who talks a lot with students and those who go to school. What is your personal story? What really works? Because you're a practitioner, you're the one who, I mean, being a director of the science museums means that you have to communicate all the time with all kinds of audiences. It was nice to hear Dagny's expertise on this, but I would like to hear your personal story. What really works?
Okay, I'll thank you, Eva. I'll go back to the beginnings, actually. My very earliest research work was as a rocket scientist to build instruments and experiments to fly on rockets and satellites, to look outwards, to study the universe. And getting our equipment above the atmosphere opened up windows that had been closed to us previously. And so this was a very, very exciting time. And I was always keen to tell people about it. Obviously, I taught my students about it, but I gave public lectures. And I found that whereas there was, people were commonly supposed to be not interested in science, but I found that if you talk to them about it in ways that, you know, were about your personal story and the thrill of discovery, they got really interested and really supportive. So I've always tried to have a balance between what I do and what I talk about. So I spent quite a bit of time studying the cosmos and the sun. And then I was at the end of a major project, and a friend and colleague, an American friend and colleague, showed me some data from NASA's first sort of scientific satellite studying the Earth. It was to study the oceans. And I thought, wow, I hadn't thought of that, turning the satellites over. This is in 1981, turning the satellites over, other than just for meteorology, but really to study the oceans and ice. I thought, wow, that's really interesting. We could really, for the first time, see the planet in its, you know, as a whole, in its great beauty, dangling in the darkness of space, but we could study it in ways that we could never do by crawling around on the surface. So I built up a new group, and it's interesting that I managed to attract quite a few bright young students. One of them still remembers, she heard me give a lecture and said, and was halfway through her undergraduate course, is not feeling very happy, a bit lost. And she said, that's what I want to do. And she went to the people, her administrator, and said, I want to change my course and work with Chris Rapley. And he said, he's mad. He's trying to use satellites to study the ocean. And she said, yes, that's exactly why I want to go and work with him. So having that sort of connection and getting around you, you know, really bright and, you know, smart young people to address these issues is very thrilling. I went on from that to run one of the big international global change research programs, where we not only had to break down the barriers that build up between different specialisms in science. So it's actually quite hard even for a biologist to speak to a physicist because of the different languages they use, technical languages, and the different ways they think. But studying the Earth as a whole covers pretty much the whole gamut of science, you know, from the natural sciences right through to the social sciences. So we first of all had to overcome all of those little cells and silos that the science is being carried out in, and take all the pieces of the jigsaw and put them together so that we could see the big picture emerge. but we also had to break down language barriers and cultural barriers. So part of my whole career has been about how you dismantle barriers and connect things in creative ways. As you mentioned, I went on to run British Antarctic Survey and then run the Science Museum. These were quite different. One was about running an institute that did interdisciplinary science, asking the big question, how are we contributing something valuable to society through the work that we're doing? What knowledge and understanding are we creating that can be passed over to decision makers, business people, politicians, the general public? And then the Science Museum is a venue. So the question there is, why do people come? What are they looking for? How do you connect them with an object which may never have been intended to be put on display, not like an art object? So I spent a lot of time thinking about how you connect with people. And one of the things I've discovered is that in science, there is this pressure constantly to be incredibly rigorous and to not show any emotion. There's a sort of fear that if you do that, your rigor and your impartiality will be undermined. But actually, if you just sit down with people and say, do you know what, if you want the formal lecture, I can give it to you. But if you just want to sit with me and listen to what I think and what I speculate and what I'm not sure about, what I fear, where my hopes lie, then you can make that connection. So that's really been my story, and that's where I am now. I'm running a commission at University College London, which is all about how we communicate. And I no longer really work with my natural science colleagues, although I obviously keep very much on top of the climate science. But I work with neuroscientists and narrative specialists and marketeers and writers, documentary makers, people who are at the interface between the arts and sciences. And we're finding more ways to help people overcome their fear and concern and change the framing from one of a problem into an activity. Because what we know from psychology is that far from facts and figures driving action, it's completely wrong. That doesn't happen. It's actions that drive beliefs, and then beliefs drive further action. So we change the story to say, look, we are where we are. This is what we're doing. Let's talk to you, have an adult conversation, and see what you can do to contribute. And if we all contribute together, then the future will be better.
Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned that you work also with neuroscientists, and I think it's very important when it comes to communication. Neuroscientists are those who actually explore how we get messages, how we, deal with them. If you had the chance to talk to them about climate change, how do young people or whatever segments get the message better?
Well, it's interesting that when I talk to my senior natural science colleagues and say, do you know what, it's really, really important to understand the limitations of how our brains work. We're all equipped with the Paleolithic Mark I brain, however much some of us might want to think that we've got a superior model. And it has many, many strengths, but many, many weaknesses. It takes shortcuts to interpret what's going on in the world and to seek the answer to the question, what's in it for me? How can I defend my interests? And it makes huge mistakes. I mean, we all know of people who passionately believe in things that we see the evidence says are completely wrong. All of us, it's almost certain, believe in something which is probably not right, but the cleverer we are, the more able we are to defend it. So as soon as you begin to understand these weaknesses and fallacies about how the human mind works, how people's reaction to information is much more based on their values and their instincts than the actual evidence, then one can begin to shape and frame the messages in ways that connect with people, make sense to them, answer the question, how does this affect me? How can I make my life better as a result of this knowledge by taking some action?
Thank you. Dagny, do you have any response to that?
Yes, it was very nicely put about that actions drive beliefs. Yes, I totally agree with this. And even this is how I ended, that even smallest actions matters. And just before this discussion, maybe one week ago, I posted in my Instagram account the question, No, it was 2 years. No, it was two weeks ago when this last climate change report was published. And I said that I asked people, what you think about it and what you do in your everyday life. And I was amazed how many responses I received, actually, that people think about these topics, that they try to change their everyday lifestyles, habits. And I think it's very, very important. But it's also very important what Chris said, that yes, we are emotional beings. And I think that we've been in this trap for many decades, thinking that we are rational beings. Yes, we are, and we want to be, and we want to explain the world with through the rationality lenses. But it's not enough. We are also very emotional beings, and we are beings. We are human beings who also make mistakes, and that's okay. This is what makes us human beings. But connecting it to this climate narrative, I think it's very important that we build it from drama story to love story in a way. That we build it from science, statistics, but also connected to emotions, to experiences, to empathy. And how we can do it, many various ways. Of course, one is on a personal level. To experience nature, to be there out with nature. It's about mindset change. And I think that during pandemic, it was interesting to see that when we were in lockdown, suddenly our shelter became nature. Everybody went out in the nature, walking, trekking, skiing, skating, being there with friends. So suddenly nature became our only shelter and the place where we could find a peace and serenity, and it became a place where we could save our body and the soul. Me personally, I made a decision. It was in June that last year, after all this mess in springtime, that I want to switch off. And what did I do? I went solo trekking. I got into the bus in Riga. I went to Latvian-Lithuanian border, and I walked alone along the sea coast, 500 kilometers alone, 1 month. It was one of my best experiences so far. I had a feeling that I have traveled all around the world. But it was very much about my connections with nature, my dialogue with nature, my connectivity with nature, my relationship building with nature as a friend, but not as a natural resource, how we used to say. So it was very, very powerful. And I think that how you can bring this awareness is by going out in the nature. This is one part. But of course, about communications, and here I agree with Chris a lot, that there are many things we can do. For example, one is, I think in general we should take more interdisciplinarity in the field. If scientists are so much trusted, but they're afraid to speak in emotional language, so we just have to find a great, we have to pair them with arts, with artists, with museums, with different lifestyle activists, with film and music industry. And I think this is the way how we can put and add more emotions, and therefore could find the path to people's hearts. Another thing I think which is very important to drive this positive circle of beliefs that something positive can happen is that we need success stories. We really need success stories. And for example, the climate change conference in Glasgow, I really do look forward some real decisions by politicians, policy makers, that they can agree about something. If it doesn't happen, again, I think this belief question is on stake. The third thing is climate literacy. Yes, it's a very complicated topic. So are these storytellers, are they educated about this? Do they understand the complexity? Do they spend enough time to understand topics? And of course, communications and conversation skills in general. I think, and therefore this festival is a very important place we are here. And as I learned from organizers, almost 80% of discussions here are more or less connected with climate topics, so it's very encouraging. But we need to have these safe, open discussion spaces where different opinions can come together. Because I think so far discussion has been very much driven by anger, by me and you and we and them, and you know, very much anger, very much opposition. But common solutions could be made only when we can discuss things. And there are very many things on stake on all sides, and there are big price tags attached to all these decisions. So I think it's long way for us to go, but time is ticking, and we should agree on many steps to move forward. When we refer again to this global village and think globally, act locally, I would say that pandemic experience in a way was positive, that showed that we as global villagers, as global communities, that we can mobilize around something if we believe that there's something we can mobilize around, and our actions can influence the situation. I don't know what is the issue we can mobilize around regarding climate change, but I'm very much looking forward that there should be and there will be something.
Thank you. You already shared your personal positive experience by telling about your walk near the Latvian sea border, those 500 kilometers. So you're kind of following Chris's advice to share those experiences. And you also mentioned that there should be more positive actions. Can you maybe name one or two that has impacted you, like positive action from politicians or from, I don't know, NGO that has inspired you, that makes you want to do something about the climate change in this stubborn positivity?
Yes, for example, fashion industry. And I don't know, somehow, I don't know why and how it happened, but just recently I learned that actually fashion industry is very big polluter. And the fashion industry is actually the one which
is the second largest in the
world. Yeah, the second largest polluter of industry polluter in the world. And I was thinking, wait, what does it mean? You know, what does it mean? How I can change my lifestyle, my fashion habits, and I'm on the way of changing my fashion habits. Yeah.
Thank you. And you also actually tackled a really important issue, which is the environmental literacy, so climate literacy. And I think we know, you know, media literacy, we talk about lots of things about the sexual literacy, etc., etc. And somehow, at least in Latvia, I don't think we talk enough about this. Well, of course, in biology classes, we talk it in the festival LAMPA, of course, in some specific discussions. But this is something that really bothers me because, of course, the climate change, we have a lot of funds, we have a lot of financial supports for media, for NGOs, for governments, for local municipalities to have climate change issues on the table. So like me as a national broadcast journalist, I get this all the time. You know, from arts festivals, from politicians, I hear it all the time. So the information comes from so many sources that sometimes even I, who is a journalist, I'm a bit confused. What sources should I use to actually, you know, create my own scripts, to work as an editor, which actually, sometimes I'm really alone in this. So I would like to ask Chris, what are the sources that you use to get the information about the climate change, or you would suggest others to use practically?
Okay, well, I've sent some suggestions. I mean, there's a bewildering array of websites on the internet, and a bewildering array of books. There are so many books published on climate change, but I just picked, let me start with the books. Christiana Figueres, who of course has been a leading light in the political action on climate change, with a co-author, wrote a book a year ago called The Future We Choose. And it's nicely presented. The first chapter presents a world of 2050 where we don't take adequate action, and it's pretty alarming and a pretty frightening vision of how things could be. But then the next chapter is exactly the opposite. It's 2050 where we have got together, worked together, overcome our differences and the various barriers, and actually acted on climate change. So it's exactly as the book's title says, the future we choose. And then the rest of the book is a kind of how-to guide on what you as an individual, as a employee, and as a political player in a democracy can achieve, various options. So I think that comes over as a very optimistic book. It shows us what the dangerous path is, but it gives confidence, stubborn optimism that if we put our minds to it, we can follow a better path. There's a book called Drawdown by Paul Hawken, which looks at all the different ways that we can pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Of course, the wonderful Greta Thunberg has written her book, No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference. And I just comment on that those of us who have been delivering this message, often to deaf ears, for 30 years or so, we look back and roll our eyes that a young schoolgirl in her second language could have made a bigger impact and have a following of millions of young people around the world in a way that we didn't manage to achieve. But, that's brilliant, absolutely great. And we can all learn from Greta. Mike Berners-Lee, one of my colleagues in the UK, has written a book called There's No Planet B. And again, it offers all sorts of thoughtful options about the way we can get unstuck and do things. And then there's a book by a journalist that is about it's framed in terms of the problem. It's called The Water Will Come, and it's about sea level rise. But it's written in an incredibly engaging way. And despite the fact it's a rather gloomy prospect, I found it quite uplifting in that one could really engage with it and see how the different forces, the political forces, the financial forces, and so on, were playing out. And then a few years ago, 5 years ago, I was introduced to a very influential theatre director in the UK called Katie Mitchell, who had just put on a play with Steve and Emmett called 10 Billion. And she was looking for a climate scientist to work with her to write and act a play in London's West End. And we really got on well. I worked with the playwright Duncan Macmillan, and we wrote the play 2071, The World Will Leave Our Grandchildren. And that's been published, that was published by John Murray. And it's the transcript of the script. And in a 45-minute read, that will just take you through my personal view about climate change and where we're headed as of about 5 years ago. Things have changed a bit since then, but it's still worth a read, plugging my own work. As for websites, there's a list of those, and I suggest that people have a look at them. I've tried to use ones that are really easy to connect with. And I've put some in that deal with the climate skeptic world and explain why a lot of the denialist arguments aren't correct.
Thank you. Thank you. And the organizers are promising that this list that Chris mentioned will be found on the British Embassy in Latvia Facebook website on this event. So those who didn't manage to write down all the suggestions, it will be found online. And thank you, Chris. I think it's really nice to have some practical advice on this. We also have a question from Mikus Dublitskis, and he's asking, hi, what about fake news about climate change? I think we should refer to Dagnia to ask about fake news. I mean, it's a very hard question. I mean, how to avoid it?
I think then we can turn to the question of media literacy, right?
Sure.
What are your media consumption habits, and how you can distinguish the real news and fake news? But I think that we should be ready that there will be more and more fake news also on climate change, because it will just become a bigger and bigger topic. And I would say that we might speculate that pandemic at the moment is the biggest topic, but wait, I think that climate change will be the next, and we really should prepare for that. And how to avoid, just to answer the question, yeah, it's media literacy. Just always check sources, check whom you are following, why these or that news are there, and just think about your information consumption hygiene.
Mm-hmm. I know that Chris has a really nice story about his neighbor. I had an interview with Chris for lsm.lv. The interview with Chris will be published next week on Tuesday. But Chris, maybe you can tell that story. That was a really neat one.
Well, of the many stories I told you, give me a hint as to which one it was.
The neighbor one, who was very, I don't know, he was filled with the fake news and he was against the climate change, and that you...
Yes, yeah. Yes. Well, actually, it wasn't really a neighbor. It was a troll, an internet troll, who was giving me a hard time. I just back up a bit. We all know that people can come to believe things, and once they believe them, they will find the evidence they need to defend their belief. And the human brain is really, really good at that, justifying why you believe something, even when evidence is presented that might make you, in other circumstances, change your mind. And this was becoming something of a sort of internet flame war. And in the end, talking to my neuroscientist friend, he said, well, look, we know this individual doesn't live very far away. Why don't you invite him up to University College London for a cup of coffee? And so he did. He came up and we spent an hour talking to each other. And at the end, it was clear he hadn't really changed his mind, at least about his belief about climate change, but he changed his mind about me. And I became a person rather than a lightning rod for his angers and fears and anxieties. And I think that's a general lesson, that when you see flame wars on the internet, where our worst tribal instincts come to play, and we find ways of hating and loathing the other people, and saying that they're sad, mad, or bad, when in fact they're just people who have come to different conclusions about the world from us. If there are ways that one can cross that bridge, even if you don't end up changing their minds, at least you can take the heat out of the situation, and we can begin to have an adult conversation about how to move forward. And often we see in human history that people will agree to disagree on something, but still find common ground to work on. Even people who think that climate change is a hoax, we can think of some very powerful politicians across the Atlantic who believe this. It's doubtful if you said to them, do you really want the world to be worse for your grandchildren than it is now, that they would say yes. So if you can find common ground, then you can find ways to move forward.
Actually, I had a really interesting conversation yesterday. I met the President of the European Parliament, and I asked him personally, what is your biggest fear of the climate change in the future? Because he, as a politician, was talking about those, laws and everything. It was really interesting that he mentioned the same thing that Chris just mentioned, that he was afraid to leave the more the world who is more sick than now for his grandchildren. So I think it's maybe not the best example, because it's again fear, but fear of death. But I think it's a very good thing that I hear that a lot of senior people are talking about that. You want to comment on that?
Yes, and I think yes, I totally agree, with this idea about what kind of world we will leave to our future generation, and this is what actually Greta, when she started all her activities, she was raising this question and asking this to politicians, but and it's a very valid point. But I wanted to stress what I heard in the answer of Chris, that we are leaving a planet which is becoming sick, very sick. And there's one theory which is about language and framing, that it's very much in communication science, that the way how you talk about topics, it's framed how they are perceived. And there are some communications theorists who said that one way how we can change narrative about what's happening with the planet nowadays is by we should change it from like war narrative. War, death, fight, all this, to medicine language. Because when you start using medicine terminology, the planet is sick, we should help her, there's some there's diseases, and it gives this hope, right? It gives hope that you can do something. So it's interesting that I just heard that you said that he said that the planet is sick, it was it just reminded me this the framing issue, and it's just a small nuances, but it just shows you how all these small details matter from communications point of view.
And actually, sorry, Chris, you wanted to comment on that?
But could I really endorse that? I think that is absolutely right. I don't know how many people have come across Jim Lovelock and his Gaia hypothesis about the world as the superorganism. But he said years ago that the study of the planet should be called geophysiology. It's looking at the health of this living organism and seeing how, rather than being a parasite on it, we can be something that lives sustainably with it and keeps it healthy for our own good, because it is our life support system. So geophysiology is a concept that has been around for a while. And I think it's very helpful.
Also, we have a question on Facebook from Laura Krasting, and she asks, hi, do you have any success stories when the person has changed the attitude or behavior after communicating about the climate crisis? I must say, from my personal experience, I've tried to talk to many, and from my experience, facts doesn't work. But I always mention to those who doesn't believe in the climate change, I ask, do you remember how terrible July this year was in Latvia? It was sometimes plus 36 degrees Celsius. It was very uncommon for Latvians, and also it's very hard because we don't have air conditioners. So I was thinking, just sharing those experiences. But in my experience, I don't have a lot of people. I've tried to convince many, but in my experience, not so many has changed their opinions. Maybe you have, Chris or Dagnia.
I have an example. It's very difficult, certainly, when somebody is committed. I've had discussions, public discussions with people, and in the end I've said to them, what could I say that would change your mind? And it's obvious that the answer is nothing. The individual hasn't come to have the discussion to change their mind. They've come to shout at me and be angry. But I mentioned the play that I performed in the West End. And the playwright and I asked ourselves, what are we really trying to do here? Are we really trying to so energize and mobilize the audience that they run out and riot on the streets of London afterwards? And we said, no. We're just trying to give them confidence that this is real and confidence to talk about it with other people. But unexpectedly, we discovered afterwards that many of the people who came were young people in groups of work friends or social friends. And when they booked the tickets, they said, why don't we bring along, Joe or Fred or whoever was the local kind of climate denier, in their group, the sort of loudmouth who'd been on the internet and found all the reasons why this was a hoax. And it turned out that because we're very social animals, and because of the emotional impact of the theatrical sort of venue, it turned out that a number of those people who had been disbelievers in climate change, when they found themselves in a social group who obviously did believe, and when presented with the information in a theatrical venue, said, oh my goodness, how wrong I was, I've changed my mind. And then, of course, often they become the most vocal supporters. So under special circumstances, particularly social ones, you can shift people.
Thank you. There is a really short answers from you. I would like to ask about this personal actions when spreading the word. Maybe you can mention some, personal ideas how to, communicate this shortly. Dagnia?
On my personal, what could I do? Place for hope. I think it's walk the talk. It's some actions. I think I will just walk more and maybe show more nature via my social media accounts, and maybe will inspire by my walking habits. And I know I have already inspired a lot of people. Maybe inspire even more, to engage with nature, and thus in that way, to create these mutually beneficial relationship where I see nature actually a part of me. As Chris said, biological organism, complicated one, but on which we so much should rely. Yeah.
Yes, I invite you to follow Dagnia's account. She's really inspiring in this. She does a lot of activities in nature, and I think this is a really good action, very positive one, to talk about nature and to be inspired to do some small steps and actions. Chris, maybe you have a short advice.
Yeah, the most common question I get asked is, well, what can I do? I'm just a small person, and what I will do won't make any difference. And the thing to do then is to say, well, if you're stuck, let's sit down and have a talk about, you know, who you are, you know, in your private life, in your professional life, your political life. Where could we find something that you could start even this afternoon or first thing tomorrow morning, that first step on a journey that will just make you feel good, that you did something, even if it's only tiny, because as soon as you do something, makes you feel good about yourself, you talk about it to other people, and that gets you on the journey. So it's helping people become unstuck and finding the beginnings of their agency. And then amazing things happen. We don't have time, but unfortunately the media just don't cover all of the good stories there are out there about businesses and institutions and organizations and people who really are doing amazing things. I think what I'm hoping is that we're almost at a social tipping point where that becomes the story, and then we're really on the road to a better future.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, and I can only add to this that what we can do today or tomorrow after this festival is to make a, let's call it, internal audit on what we can do in each of the areas, because we should we should look at ourselves not only as individual person, even though it's very important. So the first level is to check what can I do as an individual person, to check my lifestyle, to check what I'm doing every day in terms of my resources consumption, my lifestyle. The second level is me as a consumer persona. What I'm buying, what are my consumption habits, you know, why I'm buying these things or that things, why so many. The third level, it's professional. Me as a professional person, I'm going to office, you know, I'm talking to my employer. What's my company's habits, their environmental impact? Just ask these questions. And the fourth, the last but not least, me as a political persona, which is also very important. And here, really, every voice matters, and we should help with our voice we should help to give green light to politicians to make these very harsh decisions. I've been working political campaign planning, and I know that how this planning is happening, that politicians need to have green light for issues what matters. So we should help them to raise these topics.
Yes, thank you. We have 2 minutes left, so I will try to sum up our conversation. So, about how to communicate, what to start with. So, changing the narrative from narrative of death to narrative of hope. You know, change your personal beliefs. Start with small actions. Share personal stories. Professionals, media, teachers, those who have microphones, please share your personal stories. Also, scientists. Scientists should gather smart young people, storytellers, and build trust. So we have a good resource, you know, the scientists and their students, or people who inspire, artists who tell the real stories of science and climate change. Connect things, people, interdisciplinary projects when communicating climate change. Changing story from problem to a positive action. Building up the climate literacy. Using art language to tell the climate story, use media, not use, but invite media to tell also the good stories. I think the 99% are still the threatening ones. And inspire for personal audits. And last but not least, above all, keeping stubborn optimism. This is something that I will take for me when I leave this conversation. And I would also like to mention that COP26 is going to take place this year from 1st to 12th November. For those who doesn't know what it is, it's a United Nations Climate Change Conference. It's very important. And then this is the conference where all the nations are gathered, the leaders, the storytellers. And hopefully we can all follow that online. I've been following the Paris COP and the other ones. This is one of the most important conferences on climate, so please be active, ask questions, talk to your politicians, talk to your governments, local governments, and also Latvian government to be part of it, involved. Raise your hands, as Dagny said, give a green light for Latvian politicians to be there, and also raise our hand that we want to be part of all this. So thank you, Chris, for joining us from UK, and thank you, Dagny. It's been really, really fast hour, I must say. Thank you for joining us. Thank you those who were present. Thank you for those who are listening. And atgādināšu tikai to, ka šī bija viena no LAMPAs diskusijām un arī citas jūs varat redzēt tiešsaistē. Un prieks, ka šis pasākums iesaist tik daudz klimata aktīvistus. Thank you.
Thank you.
Man kā tiešraides cilvēkam liels prieks, ka mēs beidzām tieši laikā. Jā, liels paldies. Ja ir kādi jautājumi Dagnijai, lūdzu, mums diemžēl nebija iespēja iesaistīt jūs kā publiku, jo man liekas dzirdēt to, ko saka Kris, viņš ir tiešām raķešu zinātnieks, kurš piedalās Altenboro raidījumos, Davida, un viņš ir cilvēks, ko man liekas, tas, ka Lielbritānijas vēstniecība viņu ir piesaistījuši šim festivālam, ir vienkārši tiešām nebijis precedents. Bet jums ir kāds jautājums Dagnijai, lūdzu. Viņa iztaisnojas muguras, sarkanas lūpas, gatava fotografēties, runāt, un arī droši man jautājiet, ja kāds jautājums vai ierosinājums.